Welcome everybody to Social Responsibility and Artists. My name is Susan Forrest and I'm going to be our moderator for today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just read out the topic, make sure that you're in the panel that you want to be in. It says, not every writer feels compelled toward including social responsibility in their craft, but for some, it is a foundational part of their work. Join us as our panel discusses how artists play a role in fostering positive social change and why that role is vitally important. So today I'm going to, I'll be the moderator. I have a few questions. I'll ask my panelists to introduce themselves. At about the 30-minute mark or so, we'll open it up to questions from the audience, and we should be done about 10 to 5. That sound good? We're good. Okay, so maybe we could start at the far end and go right ahead.
Hi, I'm Matthew Bin. I'm playing the part of Hayden Trenholm, who you see in your program. I'm subbing for Hayden today. I'm an author from Oakville, Ontario. I recently published Brendan's Way, which was heavily influenced by my own political feelings, and so I think that's why Hayden asked me to sub for him on this one today.
Pardon me, is Hayden here again?
He is. He's been avoiding you personally, unfortunately. Sorry. But yeah, he's the Bundoran table is in the merchant table 12. Absolutely.
I have to say one reason I was almost late was I saw him in the merchant's room and I said, "What are you doing here? You've got a panel in 5 minutes. You've got to run with me." And then he had to explain all of this. So.
Yeah, no, awesome.
So, Joy.
Hi, yeah, my name is Joy Norstrom, and I'm here as Joy Norstrom. I'm like,
Some people
I know,
do
not
that.
very exciting when you. So I'm a local author of women's fiction and short stories, and I'm also a social worker by trade. And so most of everything I do is influenced by my passions, and I spend a lot of time working with people that live on the margins of our society and economy, and I'm really committed to that in my writing and in my life.
My name is Sarah Kades-Graham. I was an archaeologist for over a decade. I also do work with Indigenous communities and oil companies, helping facilitate relationships. I do a lot of work up in the Fort McMurray region. I write eco-romantic fiction, and social responsibility is huge for me as far as the fiction work I do. Obviously, it's impacted by the day jobs that I've had and continue to do. I also write nonfiction. I'm writing with one of our homicide detectives, Detective Sweet. We're collaborating on a life lessons book on his 2 decades of policing here in our city, and that book has the whole undertone of that is social responsibility and bringing life lessons that will have a positive impact on people. So I feel when I saw this, I'm like, yay, this panel, I'm gonna love it. So great to be here, Susan.
Okay, good. So I'm Susan Forrest, as I said, and I write mostly science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I've got about 25 or 30 short stories and a collection and 1 novel published, and do some editing and some teaching as well. In terms of social responsibility, it's interesting that you mentioned being a social worker. I had forgotten for a minute. I did spend 5 years working at William Roper Hull Child and Family Services with emotionally disturbed children, and I have a real passion about the environment as well because of everything that's going on, but also because I have a brother who lives in northern BC who is like a rabid environmentalist. But to the best of my knowledge, he has not set any bombs.
Yet.
Noted.
Yet. So why don't we just start off with the topic as written, and I'm going to ask my panelists to start with, do you feel compelled toward including social responsibility in your writing, and is it foundational to your writing? I think we've sort of got a bit of that already, but why don't you jump in with maybe some of the why and the roots of that?
Doesn't matter who starts.
Go ahead, whoever wants to.
Okay, I will. It is instrumental in my writing, and I know this will sound really naive, but when I heard that not all writers feel that compulsion, I was like, am I doing it wrong? What? What is going on? But it is so, like, it's just ingrained in in me, and so in my creative process, it's just gonna, that's what it is. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if you're going to do it, it probably is going to happen very naturally. Like, it's not something that I actually spend time thinking about. And I do think if people want to explore social issues because they're like, oh, this is a hot topic and it'll sell, and they're not actually passionate about it, I think you can tell as a reader.
It'll fall flat.
It falls through the story. So, yeah, it's not actually something that I I've obviously was already established in my career, and I started writing after that, fiction. And it's not something I spent a lot of time thinking about it, but it just kind of naturally started coming up in all of my stories and all the concepts that I had. And I've tried writing things that maybe don't include, and it just doesn't work for me. It's just part of my voice and who I am, I think, as a writer.
You know, I mean, I'm assuming a lot of people in this room are writers, and you care about what you write. And you care about it for a reason. And one of the reasons you might care about it is because it's bigger than yourself. The reason you throw your writing out there into the world is because it's bigger than you. And I think that tends to connect to why we write about social issues, or why we write about political issues, or why we write about what really drives us. Myself, I was at a writers' conference in Victoria during the G20 in Toronto. I'm from the Toronto area originally, or still. I've always been from the Toronto area, and I was not at the G20 marching and aggravating police, and as I like to do, because I was in a writers' conference in Victoria, and I was watching the burning police car on the TV, and I think that's where this novel really started, was saying, how do you engage as a person? How do you get into, and it's those bigger questions. The novel's built for questions about society. It's the only form we have that really is big enough and textured enough and brings in enough thoughts to be able to talk about society. And if we don't get into social issues there, where the hell are we going to do it? You know, it's not in it's punk rock lyrics. You know, it's going to be something like a novel. And I think that if we have that drive, the novel is an automatic way for us to go. And I don't think it's a surprise that we're all novelists on this panel. You know.
Can I say something on that? So I think you're talking about the format of the novel. I think we can shout out about social issues in 140 characters. We can
Sure.
do that. But can we really explore kind of how we feel about our world and how we fit into that world? I think novels, I agree, a novel it's a storytelling, and storytelling, unlike maybe 140 characters, can foster empathy for someone else's lived experience, or maybe for understanding about the environment differently maybe than other formats. Not that I'm not on Twitter. I am, you know. Engage with me.
Sorry, can I walk that back just before? I don't mean that there aren't other legitimate avenues. It's just that when we get into these complex social issues, I think we have gravitated towards this maybe for a reason. Sorry.
I was just gonna add that the books that I read and really resonate with and remember, and those are the ones that have a social commentary or maybe introduce a perspective that I hadn't considered. And I always love reading those. So when I started writing, it was in there, and I didn't realize how strongly it was in there until, you know, a couple books in, you're like, whoa, yeah. But I also feel that with the novel, it's a kind of a side door to, because people want to be entertained, but it's like a kind of sneak attack to introduce other perspectives, maybe open up some dialogue, get the reader asking themselves questions, because if you write so that they get sucked into it, right, then they're not really realizing what's I guess kind of also what's because they're just reading the book. Right?
It's not a lecture.
It's not a lecture. It's not a 2x4 upside the head. It's not setting a cop car on fire, which Dave would really be mad if I did that. So it's just for me, it's a more strategic way to share what I feel. Open up dialogue in a way, because like with this book, I've had oil clients say, you did a really good job of balancing the environmental side and the oil side. And I am a tree hugger at heart, but I also work for oil companies sometimes. So in me, I have to reconcile that. And in the story, I absolutely had to reconcile that. But it was really fun, because then I could explore, how do I feel about this? And what messages do I want people who don't have a chance to work in the jobs that I've done, or to hear the stories and the very polarizing stories that I've heard. So it's a gentle sneak attack, you know, to hopefully open up dialogue that maybe wouldn't have had a chance to open up.
Yeah.
Well, the brain is wired for story, right? What do they say? 700,000 people being killed is a statistic. One person being killed is a tragedy, right? So we can understand that. But going a little bit further, I think of the role of the artist in society. I think that the artist is society's leader. Politicians are not society's leaders. Politicians have to do what the people who are voting, want them to do. Now, it's always a two-way street. You have politicians who say, do it my way, da-da-da-da-da-da. But we give power to people. And we give power to people through the major discourse. So there are a zillion discourses happening all around us in the media and in individual conversations and in art and in books, right? All the time. But what is the major discourse versus the minor discourse? So I'll give you an example of this, and it comes out of environmentalism. There was a time, and maybe it still is today, but I would argue maybe that it's changing a little bit, that it didn't really matter whether the environmentalists wanted to protest the dam or the pipeline or the whatever, because there were hoops, and the companies would go through those hoops, but everybody knew that it was going in the end. Didn't we have an Environment Minister, Klein, at one point, who flew over a dam over the Old Man River, and our Environment Minister said, nah, that dam's going in, because so much of the work had already been done, right? And so there was this underlying assumption, Alberta's got to sell its oil. I mean, there's no question it has to sell its oil. So there's no question there might be hoops, but it was going to go through. And I would argue that that is changing. And I think it's changing because the discourse is changing. And that discourse is led by newspaper reporters, and it's led by novelists, and it's led by artists. And as that discourse changes, we're now in a position where maybe those pipelines are still going through, et cetera, but it's not a done deal. It's not an underlying assumption immediately right now. It could actually go the other way. So I'm going to throw that out in terms of the artist in general and the major discourse as a leader in political decisions.
Well, it's interesting with a politician and with an artist, we think that they're very different. But I mean, I understand there's probably a lot of Trump supporters in the room, tends to be around writers' conference, everyone's like, yeah, make America great. But what actually motivated people to vote for him was not, okay, that was sarcastic. That's sarcastic. But what made people vote for him was not a logical assessment of his views, whatever they might be, and of the claptrap that he tends to spew out on an hourly basis. It was emotion. Right? That's what gets people motivated to vote for somebody. And it's also, Justin, it was an emotional appeal that rode him to a majority. As artists, don't we traffic in emotion as well? And if we don't do a good job of emotionally capturing the reader and then, as you say, kind of sliding the dagger of truth into their side is gently. Or whatever way we get that truth across. But we both use emotion to make that bridge between what we think, what we care about, and what the voter, the reader, the society cares about. So we actually traffic in the same things, and I think that is pretty promising, considering that we've seen some big political movements and some troubling political movements over the recent past. Wouldn't it be great if we could tap into that as artists as well and shape those political movements or shape those societal movements, those bigger questions, and influence them that way. And I think things like talking about like eco-fiction, I think is a great way of doing that,
And I mean, music, how many documentaries talk about the music that changed, or, like the 60s, the music did this, the 70s, it did this, etc. But I know for me, books have had that same power. And when you're talking about emotion, I know the word manipulation has a negative connotation, but as authors, we choose words specifically to manipulate the reader because we want to take them on a journey, right? Like, so we use words to manipulate the emotions of the reader, how we want, like that's what we do. And I hate to like manipulate is such a
We
harsh
build
word.
empathy.
Thank
you.
Like that. We build empathy. Yes.
Well, we reach out and touch a reader, or we capture a reader on a different level from just, as we say, it's not a 2x4 to the head, it's not a lecture, it's something closer than that.
And when you talked about, 7,000 dead is a stat, but 1 dead is a trend, like, and when you get, so we can use that tool when we're writing, so that to make people feel. And when we feel, we think. When we think about stuff, we might actually
Change our behavior.
change our behavior or not be apathetic to stuff. It promotes action or perhaps inspires action, I should say.
I think kind of going into my day job a little bit here, and even with short stories, like sometimes we think about whose stories are told and heard in a society and whose stories are silenced or ignored. And one of the things that you can find out easily by Googling, but I do work for a level of government, and we can, you can share statistics with decision makers. You can have very polished reports and very great public speakers sharing that. But one thing that is so effective to creating policy change is when, we can encourage and foster people whose voices aren't often heard to share their story with decision makers. That's when we're really able to get some changes, some social policy changes happening. So when I think about that in terms of writing, we're playing with emotions in a sense, but I never, I guess it's something I'm thinking about. Am I doing it in a,
What's
I
your
never
intention?
mean to, my intention isn't to hurt. So even with, my book that came out last year, I have had some mixed reviews. Most have been great. And I had an email from someone the last couple of weeks saying, thank you for telling this story, which is really similar to mine. And there's some women's health issues in it. So, and fertility-based kind of issues. So it was a beautiful letter and about her experiences in hoping to get this stuff out in the media more. But I've also received some reviews where it was like, hey, this was traumatic for me because I had a very similar situation. So I've been thinking about kind of those issues a lot, about the impact on people of story. And it can be very powerful. And I'm sticking to the intention. What was my intention? It certainly wasn't to traumatize, but...
But your intention will be woven throughout that whole thing.
Yeah.
Right? So
yeah,
even
and for the
women-
most part, I've been happy to hear that's how people feel.
It is like when you hear of somebody having an emotionally negative response to work you did, oh my God, that's gotta suck. But your intention certainly wasn't to do that.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I'm able to balance that because you hear from more people, and I think the people I've heard that from are, we don't know their lived experience, and, the issues are related to women's issues that aren't funded very well in the country that they're from. So I think that does tell some of the story. We don't know the whole story, but we know that there's something we hear about in the media a lot.
And if it triggered that, if it triggered responses enough to have people actually communicate that with you, then maybe it is a dialogue that should be opened up, right?
Yeah.
So,
which is really where maybe the change can happen, is through dialogue.
yeah.
But I think it shows that you're doing your job too, because you're creating a response in people, whether it's the response you're looking for or not, and that may be singing to the choir, or preaching to the choir, but there's a whole congregation out there that also could be affected in the same way. And I think it's a sign that you've done your job as a novelist or as an artist.
I could pay this guy to hang out.
So let me talk a little bit about art and craft. I think that as artists, we also have to be highly skilled craftspeople. Picasso could paint faces. He chose to use his art to show faces from different angles, right, and show conflicts at the same time. So as artists, I think we are also craftspeople, but I wonder if some of the work that you see out there that maybe doesn't resonate with people as much tends more to the craft side and less to the art side.
Well,
Yeah.
Okay, I'm a huge fan of Miriam Taves, and I think she does both. But
Hopefully, when you have great art, of course you have great craft. But what about a highly crafted story that maybe doesn't have much of a heart and soul to it?
right. Oh, I see what you're saying.
Well, I remember, Sarah, I saw your one or two panels of you last year at When Words Collide, and you were talking a lot about romance writing and that kind of stuff. And I think if you don't use the craft, for example, in the kind of fiction that you're putting forward, we were talking about, if you don't use that craft to create that emotional response and use that romance, use romance tropes, use romance formulas, and satisfy the reader for that, you don't have the chance to put in the other stuff.
Yeah,
And that's
exactly.
what gives it value, I think.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with writing romance that doesn't have anything deeper in it. I think that, like, we're humans. We like these things. I wrote a thrilling little assassination tale here, and actually it was, for myself, it was also bringing in, and it was, my editor helped a lot in bring out that political stuff that actually drove the tale, that it was actually about, but it wasn't on the page enough. But I think unless you have that thriller or that romance or whatever else is going to capture the reader.
That's the medium to deliver the message.
Exactly. So that's, our lecture is in there, but it's secret because we're good craftsmen,
Yep,
craftspeople.
exactly. I do want to say too, and I'll bring up the music example. My husband teases me because I love country music, and he loves all sorts of music, kind of a music connoisseur. Loves some country, but some of it he's like, oh my God, how can you listen? So for technically, I guess it's not super complicated or whatever. Like sometimes I just need a 3-chord song. Sometimes that's just what I need. And with books, sometimes I need to not have to reread a few sentences. I just want to escape or whatever. But other times I want to be just captivated. So yeah, there is space in the market for books that have that, I guess, underlying theme that of social responsibility. And then there is absolutely a place for, you know what, I just need to not be on right now.
Yeah.
So the phrase social responsibility suggests choosing what you think is a positive moral standpoint and arguing in its favor. Yeah, that
jump in
sounds
here?
really loaded, right?
Can I totally jump in here?
Okay.
So I realized actually after I wrote this book and while working on the book with Detective Sweet that I love to be a bridge between polarized communities. That's, I guess, my thing, which I didn't realize was my thing. My day job between Indigenous communities and oil companies, very polarized viewpoints often. And here, the environmentalists and the oil component, again, polarized. Cops, and apparently not all the public like cops, and that's why they burn cars and whatnot.
Or bring up signs and march down
Yeah,
Yonge Street. Yes,
exactly.
we do that too.
So I realized that I love to build bridges, but how do you build a bridge? Well, you have to put it in a place that someone's going to walk across, right? So you use those mediums, whether it's a fiction novel or this nonfiction life lessons one that we're working on. So you pick a strategic place to build the bridge, and then you craft it in a way that you hope communicates your messages so that two groups of folks who wouldn't necessarily find common ground or try to find common ground in your book. And then if they recognize that it's possible in your book, then it's kind of like breaking that, what was it, the 3-minute mile or 4-minute mile? Once it broke, then everybody was doing it. Not me, but but once it happens in a book, right? And that listening and actually, listening to another group that you might not have, then maybe they'll do that in real life.
So let's have a little how question. How would you work toward giving the theme of your story resonance and the social responsibility idea without being didactic, without being
Yeah.
okay, everybody, you have to do this, or you have to think my way.
I think, and even a bit to your question two questions ago, is that the personal, everyone's heard that personal is political. And so I think it still comes down to a character's journey, a character's story, and it's a person, right? So they're going to experience, a lot of different things along the journey and maybe question themselves and things. So I'm actually always more concerned about the kind of the lived, the person and environment. It's a very social worky phrase to mean that we live within a community and within kind of a
Milieu.
system. Yeah, and so I see that, like, when I go to write a story, whether it's short fiction or longer, I'm really focused on that person's journey. I'm not actually totally focused on the social issues. They just kind of seem to weave in naturally. I think if you're focused on the point of view of that character.
And I mean, I as a writer, we know to create conflict and so on. And one of the tricks that I use as a writer to get that emotion up, get that, like, I kick the crap out of this guy, make this character go through all these, make it worse and worse, so that as a reader, and I hope the reader identifies with the character, and I hope the reader has some connection with them and sympathizes. But then as things get worse and worse, I want the reader to say, that's not right, that shouldn't be happening. And that's what I want. I mean, if by the end of the book, the reader hasn't said, well, I'm pissed off. I'm not doing it because I wrote this because I was pissed off. And I know anger isn't the best medium necessarily to put a point across, but I think it's a good motivator for a lot of things. And I don't advocate burning cop cars or anything, but I do advocate using that emotion, using that idea, this idea of, let's say, something's wrong or we have to do something, and using that as the dynamic that drives a character's story, and drives a reader to say, I agree, I too must do something about this.
For me, what I saw in Fort McMurray, communities and companies who actually listening and talking to each other, it blew my mind because that doesn't make the news. And so my experiences of actually seeing positive change, I had to share that, but I didn't know how. So I swear, and if you guys, I'm assuming most of you guys are writers, so you'll get it. I swear that my characters had a beer, like, with that social issue, and then said, this is how we're coming out, Sarah. I don't know if any of you guys were at the library readings yesterday when, who was it who said how he kind of channeled his characters. I think it was Chris. Yeah.
Chris Humphreys.
The character said, I'm coming in as this.
I'm coming into your story.
That,
yes.
for me, that absolutely happens like a marching band.
Well, and I would say one of the issues too, one of the things that's really important is to, like you were saying, Sarah, give balanced two sides to an issue.
Yes.
Because if you come on, even if you don't have the character give a speech on page 300 in which they stand on a soapbox and tell you directly exactly how you're supposed to think, you can still have a very didactic story if everything that happens to that character is, he got beat up by the cops again. He got beat up by the cops again. So it's all through action, and it's all shown, not told, but it's still a didactic story. And I think part of the response to that is to also show the other side, so that you can say, yeah, we're listening. It's a complex issue. There maybe isn't a 100% right or wrong. You have characters who have doubt in their hearts, who say, you know what, maybe I should be doing it the other way. And so let me just throw that out as a technique for staying away from the didacticism.
Yeah.
Well, I would say, that's something, it's a good point, because I think as a novelist, and this is where a novel is a great medium for this kind of thinking, I'm saying get angry, and there's another person in the novel saying, but hang on, there's a reason the status quo exists. Or, as a cop, I'm angry too because you guys are breaking windows and or torching cars and that kind of thing. So I think you're absolutely right that there's a reason that there's conflict and representing both sides, or bringing in both sides and making both sides actually have a say, maybe is what we're after here, is in order to make this more than just a didactic pounding on the table, which I do from time to time, but I do understand that there's somebody else on the other side of the table pounding it at me as well.
And to make it that balanced,
They're an idiot, though.
right? What my editor advised me when I was writing this one, she said, don't let the reader know your side. Be so balanced in the side you write, how you write it, that the reader will not know what your side is. And I thought about it, I'm like, dang, girl, that's a good idea. But that was just the advice I needed, and then I could really run with it. I also wanted, what you said too, it's not, my writing style isn't, I don't want to tell people what to think. Because man, if somebody tells me what to think, I will purposely not, like heels dug in. So yeah, it's not telling people what to think, but showing possibilities and perspectives that maybe weren't considered before.
Help them move slightly from a position to a slightly different position.
Or it doesn't have to be slight, it could be a landslide. If you write it in a way that I find, because again, I don't like, when I read, I don't like being told, what to think or how to think, because then I will put the book away. So when I write, I want to write in a way that gives people options and kind of lays out some emotions, some feelings, some circumstances that happen, so that the reader, right? Because what's that saying? Like when you kind of guide somebody to come up with the idea on their own, right? So
I think, stories aren't, it's not really the author's soapbox. I mean, I think if you write it that way, it's not going to be that enjoyable. It is a character's journey and their experiences. So, I mean, that's kind of.
I'm kind of curious about yours.
Yeah,
Well,
now
actually-
I'm going to be picking up this Matthew Binn book.
Well,
but,
I actually.
I mean, maybe you disagree with me on that.
No.
which is
One of the
fine.
things that actually got me to this point with this book was I was at another guest at this conference. I was talking to him, and he was talking about theme in science fiction, and he said your theme is X. Your main character is the person in the universe who is most opposed to agreeing with that theme. And that's absolutely where this turned for me, and this novel became something worthwhile. Was that if your theme, in my case, my theme is you cannot make political change without sacrifice, without personal sacrifice. And my main character had to be the guy who said, "I'm not doing nothing. There's no way I'm getting involved in this." And I mean, okay, it actually sounds like Luke Skywalker, doesn't it? Oops, or Han Solo, sorry. But anyway, that's the kind of idea. We absolutely have to create that argument. That's what the novel is about, is that argument, so that the reader can come in and see both sides of it and come to, hopefully, the conclusion that we think. I hope the enemies aren't their heroes by the end of it, we kind of hope that. But you're right, that unless we legitimately put the other side there, we don't have a chance of getting the reader to really understand what we're saying.
So I know I did promise to open it up, but I am just going to try and finish this arc with one final question, then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. So be thinking about, what you want to bring up. But I'm going to throw out one more challenge, and that is, because I just argued on the side of balance, right? Here's another point of view, though, and I think maybe you just mentioned something about that, and that is that a book should have the courage to make a statement, and that if somebody wants to disagree with you, then they should write another book, and it becomes a conversation, right? Yes. Or fan letter, or hate mail, or something like that. But that if you don't make a statement, if you don't finally, like I actually had a critique of one of my novels in beta at one point, and they said, "Susan, we can't tell who the bad guy is. Like, we should know who the bad guy is, at least by the end." And I think I was trying so hard for balance that I didn't come out and make a statement. Two of my daughters, one of my daughter is an artist, another one is a writer, and both of them were told in their final year, this is a university, you have great art, yeah, you have great writing, but where's you in this? You have to infuse your art with yourself and come down and make a statement. So I'm going to throw that out. Just the opposite of what I said a minute ago.
Yeah.
You wanted consistency? No.
I'd like to make a statement. You actually have 3 daughters, and the last one's pretty cool.
Well, okay. This is my daughter right here, and she is very cool. Okay. But let me throw that out.
Yeah. You know, in the stuff that I've written, I never actually usually have a bad guy, an antagonist, because it's an internal journey. So a lot of the time, the point of view characters, the main characters, also something inside of them is really kind of what, or it's like a relationship thing. So it's a breakdown in a relationship. Yeah, I think maybe one way the argument is there's always more than one way of looking at things. So it's one person's perspective. I know in this I explored kind of presenting some of the story from a different point of view character. So you're seeing the same events through someone else's eyes. So it's kind of interesting, and I've received a lot of people have really enjoyed that. So it was kind of cool. And I don't know if it answers your question, but it's definitely it's not balanced. It's more in one direction, but you at least.
But whether
get to
you have
see
an antagonist like in a fantasy novel, like I would
Right.
write, you still make a statement.
Oh, yeah.
Your idea is defined.
it's still there. Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
Mine?
jump in.
So my statement in this one isn't the environmental side or the oil side. My statement is listen to each other.
Yeah. Okay. So,
like,
there's a
my
statement.
is like, would you guys quit being douchebags and just listen? Okay? Maybe I shouldn't have said that on this podcast.
Yeah,
but-
you're in a podcast.
Sorry, my apologies. But that was my statement. So I think that you can have balanced viewpoints, but your statement isn't necessarily what each character is shouting. I think the author's statement will be, why are they shouting at each other? Well, for me anyways, I think that's.
Yeah, and I think if we're doing something complex enough to require a novel to treat the subject, the answer will be complex as well. And I mean, I'm not one to make strong statements. I think I made it pretty clear. But I think at the end of this, it wasn't A or B is right. It's, yeah, but it sucks. It's kind of the, those kinds of, which is also a statement. But I absolutely agree that if we don't come down somewhere, then we haven't really landed the novel. Maybe we haven't finished the novel yet.
Okay, I'm going to open it out to questions from the audience. I see one here and then one there. Nicole?
I was going to say, where would you say that kind of, it seems to me that you're kind of saying that the essence of if you're trying to put forth a certain point or something like that, that you're trying to inject a little bit of doubt into the reader's perspective. And the craft is in knowing where, when, and how much of that uncertainty to throw into the mix.
Can I just repeat the question before you respond? Because we're being recorded for podcast and it won't pick up. So you're saying that a certain level of doubt is needed in the complexity of a novel, and part of the craft is in how much and how far you go. Did I encapsulate it for you?
Yeah, because if your reader doesn't know who the bad guy is, maybe you over-seasoned it.
You might have over-seasoned it if the reader doesn't know who the bad guy is. I think Joy wants to speak.
Yeah, your question reminded me of something that Susan actually said earlier this morning in the no dumping session about making your readers work for it. And I've heard you say that elsewhere. So I think the idea of kind of flashbacks and backstory very carefully put in, because we need to be able to see seeds of motivation and doubt and that kind of thing. And but really leaving it, knowing the right time of when to, for me, that's key.
When you asked that question, the first thing that popped into my head was when we have strong convictions, but somebody introduces something that makes us doubt our strong convictions, then we often will deconstruct how we feel, what we think. And then we know, actually I absolutely still believe this, or maybe, and then you may modify your opinion. So for me, when that doubt comes in, it's a chance to reflect, whether it's you personally reflecting or your characters reflecting, and kind of taking that inventory. Well, what really do I feel and believe? Is it my thoughts and feelings, or is it something I've been told to think and feel and that sort of thing? So that's why I love doubt as a tool, to evaluate and take that inventory.
I think it's a very perceptive idea, or a very perceptive concept, and I think that as an artist, if poking somebody lightly with the end of a pen is not going to do it. Whereas, and I apologize, I've kind of gone overboard with the violent metaphors, but it's a gut punch that we want to give the reader, right? And that's where I totally agree. That's where the craft is. We have to figure out where their soft spots are and exploit them like a ninja, right? And I think that you're absolutely right. And
You have great metaphors.
That's the point. That's the problem we face as a novelist is to do that and not the 2x4 over the head. And again, I hate them. I'm sorry about the violent
No,
metaphors.
you love it. Just embrace it.
Admit it, yeah.
I feel for others who may not love it as much.
Dave?
Okay, I think you're saying it's better to illuminate to get people asking questions than it is to lecture to get people chanting catchphrases.
Yes, yeah.
So that's a comment rather than a question?
Yeah.
I'll just repeat it for the podcast. You said you want to illuminate the issue rather than lecture. Yes, I think we'd probably all be saying that, yeah.
And getting people asking questions. You'd said
And
it,
getting
like
people
creating
asking
that
questions,
dialogue.
Dialogue. Yes, I see a question right here.
So my question is, do you find that there are certain topics or issues that you want to write about that you either don't feel informed enough on or don't feel that you have, or you feel that if you venture into those topics that you are exercising a privilege that is not sensitive to who the social question pertains to, and how do you deal with that in your writing? Is it just a question of more research or reaching out?
Are there questions, are there topics that we feel we're not quite informed enough to write about or don't have the privilege to write about, and how do we deal with that? Is it more research or more sensitivity? Did I get that?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, and I think, Kate, if I also not being aware of our own privilege. So telling people stories that are maybe not our own is a little bit what I'm hearing you say? Okay.
It's always a concern, and I think if I'm, as a person, motivated enough to be emotional about an issue, that better motivate me to actually understand and actually get a grip on it. And if we're going to get to the point where we're actually, let's say, writing novels about it, then we're going to have to get a deeper grip on it. I do agree, and it's certainly a concern for me, knowing that the male privilege informs what I write, and finding ways to poke holes in that for myself is important as a novelist, because it's too easy, especially in a male, I don't want to say male-dominated, but male-centric genre like science fiction. It does bear consideration, but I think we're not doing our job as a novel unless we try to test our own concerns about, try to test our own assumptions. But one of the great things about something like long-form fiction is that gives us the opportunity to do that. And I do have an editing group who will call BS on me on things as well, and that's an important part of the process too.
I think in that case, make sure you pick your beta readers really well. Right?
Sensitivity readers.
Yeah, I guess that would be a better phrase to
Yeah.
use. Or maybe even alpha readers earlier in the process. So that, because it's a minefield, depending on what topic you're writing about. But anything where sensitivity is a question, and you already know it's a question because you're asking right now, that's a minefield that I would just walk as delicately and as gently as possible and be as informed as possible before you do it.
Yeah, and respectfully, I do think about this issue a lot and have conversations with people about it. There are things that I want to write about that I'm not sure sometimes if I'm the right person to write about it, or if I have, enough information to write about it authentically. And also on the other side of that coin, I do want to explore more than just white, female, definitely middle-aged Canadian characters, right? And also this is the world that my children are going to inherit, and also the world that I really appreciate is a diverse world. So I think for me, it's important to have that, reflect that diversity in the stories that I write, and it's required since like I have approached people and had conversations with people, so early research, spending a lot of time thinking about things. Yes, I would a beta reader, of course, and yet still there are a few things I do choose that I'm not going to write about because I just don't feel. I know the history here in Canada. I feel very passionate about the truth and reconciliation process, and that is not like I am here to be a learner and a listener in that realm. I know for sure.
And I think as a novelist, we'd better be learners and listeners. Like you're talking about our job, right?
Yeah.
And we're not doing our job if we don't do that, I think.
Yeah.
And tough for some of us, white male.
Yeah.
But
It's also hard though because you don't want to exclude communities
yes,
because you're
afraid.
because the minefield is just too potent, right? But you don't want to exclude communities that really need to be included in your story. You know, like so it's. I think that's one of those case by case and just an intention. I think is huge, and maybe even messaging like that, dear reader, at the start of the book. So like kind of laying out what your intention for the story was, or even your motivation for the story, so that it's clear. I don't think that's gonna like cross off every person's question mark on why you chose to write on a sensitive community or a topic. But perhaps those are ways that you can get your message out, what your motivation was, what your intention is, that sort of thing.
And I think you've brought up an entire panel.
Oh, for sure.
For sure.
And we
Yeah.
do have one on diverse voices at the convention this weekend. And I sat on one and watched another one in Pittsburgh at the Nebulas this spring. And it's something that I've been particularly interested in because I'm writing a novel that takes place in 1635 and deals with the slave trade. So I'm going to just divert here for a second. I read a wonderful essay by an African-American science fiction writer, a woman, who started her essay with, "Imagine a future in space with no black people," right? So there is that whole issue of erasure, right?
Yeah.
And so on one of the panels that I was on in the spring, one of the things we talked about is it's important to have a diverse cast,
Yep.
but maybe not to recognize when you need to tell your stories, not try to tell somebody else's
Yeah, whose voice
stories.
should be telling story? Because when
So-
you said that, and I thought, oh my God, anyone else could not have done that,
Have said that.
right?
She could write that.
She could,
Yeah.
like
Yep.
but
Yep.
that would be just a
So
different reaction if anybody else would have written that opening line.
yeah, exactly. So my 1635 novel about the slave trade is from the point of view of a white person. Now I have characters in there who are black and multiple characters with multiple different viewpoints. They don't all have the same viewpoint, right? Because no group of people ever is homogenous, right? And then I also got a sensitivity reader, so.
That's good.
I would actually suggest more than one sensitivity reader.
Yeah, I know. I was in the States one time with a bunch of Americans, and they said, "What movies do Canadians like?" And I thought, I get to represent Canada? I don't know what movies Canadians like. Don't ask me. Yeah.
Yeah, what did you tell
I
me?
sort of hummed and hawed and a lot of American movies, I guess. That's what we get.
She said Anne of Green Gables.
So I'm noticing that we're coming up to our time. So I would like to say thank you so much to all of our panelists. Could we give them a round of applause? And thank you all for coming.